His father, Angel, a former Spanish soldier, had come to Cuba at the turn of the century to fight in the Spanish-American War and made his fortune growing sugarcane for the U.S.-owned United Fruit Company, the dominant economic and social force in the region at the time.
Throughout the 1940s and 50s, the Caribbean island of Cuba had been America's playground. Beaches, booze, and casinos. Havana had it all. Cuba's land and industry were owned almost entirely by American corporations.
We consider part of the United States practically, just a wonderful little country over there that was of no danger to anybody. As a matter of fact, was a rather important economic asset to the United States.
Fidel's mother, Lina Ruz, was a poor but ambitious country girl. Once described as an Annie Oakley type, she was known to fire a gun to call her family to dinner. Though Lina barely knew how to read and write, she insisted their children get the best education Angel's money could buy. Fidel and his two brothers, Raul and Ramon, were sent to a boarding school in Santiago de Cuba. But the unruly Castro boys were too disruptive and were expelled. In October 1941, at age 15, Fidel went to Havana to attend El Colegio de Belén, Cuba's best and most exclusive school. It was at Belén, under the guidance of Spanish Jesuit priests, that the young Castro began to form his worldview.
Los jesuitas que Fidel conoce en La Habana.
The Jesuits Fidel encountered in Havana in the 1940s came out of the experience of the Spanish Civil War. From the nationalist faction, the faction close to fascism. And they were steeped in the idea of the superiority of the Hispanic Catholic world over the materialistic, corrupt Anglo-Saxon world.
Fidel impressed his teachers with his athletic abilities, photographic memory, and enormous tenacity. They singled him out as someone who would, no doubt, fill the book of his life with brilliant pages. When he entered the University of Havana in 1945, he set out to fulfill that promise. The University of Havana had been a hotbed of political activity since the 1930s, when students led a revolt against dictator Gerardo Machado.
1930s is a violent period in Cuban political history. Social and political struggles continue through a good part of that decade, and the idea was that if you were
draining the Zapata swamp, planting a circle of dwarf coffee trees around Havana, creating a new breed of cattle.
Cuba was going to produce more cheese than Switzerland, more meat than France, more milk.
As one project faltered, Castro moved on to the next, always looking for the silver bullet. Finally, he turned to sugar, Cuba's traditional crop, and staked his reputation on producing 10 million tons in 1970.
Y que aquí se ha dicho que ni una libra menos de los 10 millones. Ese es el problema. Y hay que repetirlo y ratificarlo. Y sería una vergüenza increíble que nosotros nos fuéramos a quedar por debajo de los 10 millones.
The idea was, in effect, to double the size of the country's sugar harvest. And it meant turning Cuba upside down.
Best, Cubans could not turn his dream into reality.
Instead of 10 million, 8.5 million metric tons of sugar were produced in 1970. It was, nonetheless, the largest sugar harvest in Cuban history.
No voy a andar con rodeos para decirlo. creo que para mí, igual que para cualquier otro cubano y un grado muy alto, significa realmente algo muy duro. Significa algo muy duro, tal vez más duro que ninguna otra experiencia en la lucha revolucionaria.
The Soviet Union stepped in. Fidel would no longer be allowed to run the economy from his Jeep. A powerful council of ministers would make all major decisions in concert with the Soviet bloc. 10,000 Soviet advisors would lend a hand.
Castro presided over the revolution's essential capitulation to Soviet demands, organizational demands, structural demands, foreign policy demands, and perhaps one of the hardest things for Castro to accept was that he agreed to stop criticizing the Soviet Union in any fashion, direct or veiled criticism.
Delighted, Moscow rewarded Cuba with subsidies of up to $6 billion per year.
The economy began to recover through about 1976, 1977. People had a real feeling of hope that the sacrifices of the 1960s were paying off economically.
We see no virtue in perpetual antagonism between the United States and Cuba. Our concern relates above all to Cuba's export of revolution.
On March 1st, 1975, U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger made a surprising announcement.
We have taken some symbolic steps to indicate that we are prepared to move in a new direction if Cuba will.
It was the era of U.S.-Soviet détente, and President Gerald Ford moved to normalize relations with Cuba and to end the 15-year-old U.S. economic embargo.
What would you like Americans to know about you and Cuba? And could you possibly say it in English so they could understand?
In English. I am not well in English.
What could then in Spanish?
Good wish for the people to the United States.
Good wishes.
Wish of understanding. Wish of friendship. I understand it is not easy because we belong to two different worlds. But we are vecinos, ¿cómo se dice?
Neighbors.
We are neighbors. And in one way or another, we ought to live in peace. United States and Cuba.
That fall, the State Department announced Cuba and the United States were ready to begin an official dialogue. But all along, Fidel Castro had had his eye on a situation developing half a world away, preparing Cuba for its first large-scale war. In West Africa, the Portuguese colony of Angola, about to become independent, was fast sliding into civil war. The Marxist Movement for the Liberation of Angola, the MPLA, asked Castro for military assistance to fight against its rivals, backed by South Africa. Fidel Castro faced a tough choice: intervention in Angola or rapprochement with the United States. On November 7th, 3 days before Independence Day, Cuban troops arrived in force. The U.S. government was caught by surprise.
The rapprochement or normalization with the United States was derailed. He placed a higher priority on his internationalist revolutionary objectives than on better relations with the United States.
¿Qué clase de condiciones pretende el imperialismo establecer a nuestro país? Ejercemos nuestra solidaridad con Angola, estamos ayudando a Angola y seguiremos ayudando al pueblo de Angola.
By January 1976, there were 15,000 Cuban troops in Angola. Armed and supplied by the Soviet Union, they pushed back the army of South Africa and secured the MPLA in power.
The Cuban intervention in Angola identifies Cuba as a country that's willing to take a risk, willing to put its own interests on the line, willing to provoke a confrontation with the United States in support of national liberation in Africa. It boosts Cuba's prestige in the Third World enormously.
Castro assumed the role of leader of a major power. His doctors and teachers were serving as far away as Yemen. His troops were fighting in Angola and Ethiopia, in close alliance with the Soviet Union. Soon he would play a key role in another war. The Sandinista insurrection against Anastasio Somoza in Nicaragua.
The Sandinista victory in Nicaragua was directed by Fidel Castro from the headquarters of Cuba's special forces. They had broken the codes of the Somoza army, and Fidel knew all their movements and told the Sandinistas where to lay ambushes, what to do until they took power. That was a war directed by Fidel Castro.
It was Castro's first victory in the Western Hemisphere, one he'd been waiting for since 1959.
Los revolucionarios no podemos ser pesimistas. Los revolucionarios somos y seremos siempre optimistas. Tampoco nos dejaremos intimidar. Nuestros pueblos han demostrado a la larga de la historia su capacidad de lucha.
Él se ve en ese momento como la punta de lanza.
He sees himself as the spearhead of a great socialist revolution,
Que en el plazo de 10 años todo el Caribe
and believes that in 10 years, all the Caribbean is going to be dominated by Cuba, and he is going to play the key role, be the other great power, and he sees himself as a figure of that stature.
Como una figura de ese tamaño y de esa naturaleza.
In September 1979, Fidel Castro was elected leader of the Movement of Non-Aligned Nations. 1 month later, he traveled to New York to address the United Nations.
And you're always wearing your bulletproof vest?
Siempre está protegido con su traje.
¿Cuál traje?
What suit?
Everybody says you always have
Dice
a
que todo el
bulletproof
mundo
vest.
dice que usted tiene un chaleco a prueba de balas.
No. Voy a desembarcar así en Nueva York.
I will land in New York like this.
Tengo un
I will
chaleco.
land in New York like this.
Tengo un chaleco moral.
I have a moral one.
A moral
A moral vest.
Qué fuerte.
It's strong.
Those months of the fall of 1979 really were the apogee of his triumphs. Here he was, the duly chosen, selected president of the non-aligned countries, the Asian, African, Middle Eastern, and Latin American countries. How can you be a loyal, dependable Soviet ally and at the same time be the leader of the non-aligned nations? Well, Castro was able to carry out that exquisite, seemingly impossible balancing act until the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
Here you had the Soviet Union occupying a non-aligned country. Cuba was caught then between its constituency among the non-aligned and its partnership with the Soviet Union, and it refused to denounce the invasion of Afghanistan and lost extraordinary credibility with the rest of the non-aligned countries.
The following spring, Castro faced an unexpected crisis when an incident at an embassy in Havana spiraled out of control.
This bus of Cubans seeking asylum in the Peruvian embassy crashes through the gates. The two guards on each side are firing at the bus, but as the bus goes through, they shoot each other. And so Castro takes a position: we're not going to risk the lives of our policemen, keep people out of embassies when we don't care if they go in. So they remove the guards. Bad mistake, because within 3 days you had 10,000 people inside the Peruvian embassy and more headed there from all over the island.
He was totally preoccupied with international affairs in the fall and winter of 1979. I'm convinced that he was not aware of the depth of unrest on the island, unrest that was steadily growing below the surface.
Castro was enraged. He branded the refugees escoria, trash. Anyone who wanted to leave Cuba, he announced, was free to go.
No los queremos, no los necesitamos.
Cubans who so publicly turned their backs on Castro's revolution were subjected to every humiliation, harassment, even beatings, in full view of the newly opened U.S. interest section in Havana.
They were brought here in trucks and buses. They were brought here in trucks and buses. This is stimulated by the government, and the foreign minister will not answer the phone and won't do it here now.
In Miami, the Cuban exile community organized a massive sea lift, which received the blessing of President Jimmy Carter.
We are the most generous nation on earth in receiving the refugees seeking freedom from communist domination and from economic deprivation brought about primarily by Fidel Castro and his government.
The flotilla anchored at the port of Mariel, where tens of thousands were waiting.
We're taking whatever people, they give us. So we got crazy people, we got prisoners, they say political prisoners, we got some criminals. Who knows what kind of people we got here.
Castro, one senior U.S. official remarked, is using people like bullets aimed at this country.
Castro wanted to inflict the greatest possible pain on the United States. And he wanted perhaps to contaminate, in a sense, the Cuban exile community, because at that time the Cuban exile community was beginning to acquire considerable political influence in the American political process.
By September, 125,000 refugees had arrived in Miami. Overwhelmed by the influx, Jimmy Carter put an end to the boat lift.
Mariel was ashamed because it was not just Cuba's upper class that emigrated, but ordinary factory workers emigrated. Some of Cuba's leading intellectuals. Many young people who had grown up under the revolution emigrated as well. But Mariel was also ashamed because the regime showed its ugly side to the international community when it deported common criminals to the United States, committing an act of aggression, not just against the imperialist U.S. government, but against the American people.
Mariel had not yet faded from memory when Fidel Castro faced a new challenge.
As for the enemies of freedom,
President Ronald Reagan came to office determined to wage war on communism, beginning close to home. Reagan authorized the CIA to train an army, the Contras, to wage war against Castro's Sandinista allies in Nicaragua. Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev paid an overdue visit to Fidel Castro's Cuba in April 1989. For 4 years now, Gorbachev had pushed economic and political reform in the Soviet Union. And expectations in Cuba had been running high.
There was almost euphoria that Cuba would follow the steps which they had been doing for several decades of the Soviet Union in opening up. And the people I was talking to in the Cuban Communist Party were very, very enthusiastic that Cuba would open up just as the Soviet Union had opened up.
But by the time of Gorbachev's visit, those who expected Fidel to embrace perestroika and glasnost were bitterly disappointed. But it was the Soviet Union that collapsed in 1991.
From the first time Fidel Castro appears on Cuba's national stage, July 26, 1953, he has been convinced that history is on his side. And he believes so for the decades that followed until the Soviet Union collapses. All of a sudden, he knew that his world had come to an end.
The collapse of the Soviet Union was a blow. He aged at that moment. In fact, he said, "We never thought the sun would stop shining," and it did.
Y que tengamos siempre una patria digna, una patria independiente, y no una colonia yanqui. Hay que salvar la patria. Hay que salvar la revolución. Hay que salvar el socialismo. Socialismo o muerte.
Fidel was telling Cubans to preserve the revolution and to preserve socialism. They had to tighten their belts and replace cars with oxen and go back to the Stone Ages and live in caves if necessary. He said that, actually. I'm not making this up. So the stuff you saw like on the streets and everywhere, amazing, crazy.
Between the spring of 1992 and the spring of 1994, we were stunned at what had happened. Everybody was in such terrible shape that it was hard to believe they could pull themselves out of what they call this special period. It looked as if the Cuban Revolution, the regime of Fidel Castro, was finished.
In Miami, the exiled community waited for Fidel to fall and lobbied Washington to tighten the embargo. But Castro refused. In a stunning reversal, Castro opened Cuba to foreign investors and foreign tourists and allowed US dollars to circulate freely. The economy improved. Striding across the world stage in a role never intended for the leader of a small island, in the shadow of the United States.
He has managed to remain in power longer than almost any other leader in the last 100 or 200 years.
Ahora comprendo que mi destino no era venir al mundo para descansar al final de la vida.
It's a remarkable tenure. And it's testament to his political skills, to his ability to manage crises, to anticipate crises, to play as a grandmaster at chess, to play 2 and 3 moves ahead.
Castro plays David to our Goliath masterfully. Wherever Castro goes, he is applauded, not because people want to adopt the Cuban system, no, because he has defied the United States and survived.
hemos visto a muchas personas famosas cayéndose, pero nada así. ¡Ay! ¡Ay! ¡Qué duro está el piso!
Es que hasta, mira, hasta se...
¿Será que no comió bien?
No, sí, no, es el escalón, que no viene el escalón. Por eso.
Ya, no pongamos.
Mira, mira. A ver.
I know you are worried. First of all, if we are communists. And of course, I have said very clear that we are not communists.
Proclama del comandante en jefe al pueblo de Cuba. Con motivo del enorme esfuerzo realizado, día y noches de trabajo continuo, sin apenas dormir, dieron lugar a que mi salud se sometiera a un estrés extremo y se quebrantara. Esto me provocó una crisis intestinal aguda con sangramiento sostenido que me obligó a enfrentar una complicada operación quirúrgica. Como nuestro país se encuentra amenazado en circunstancias como esta por el gobierno de los Estados Unidos, he tomado la siguiente decisión. Delego con carácter provisional mis funciones como primer secretario del Comité Central del Partido Comunista de Cuba en el segundo secretario, compañero Raúl Castro Ruz. 2. Delego con carácter provisional mis funciones como comandante en jefe de las heroicas Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias en el mencionado compañero Raúl Castro Ruz. 3. Delego con carácter provisional mis funciones como presidente del Consejo de Estado y del Gobierno de la República de Cuba en el primer vicepresidente compañero Raúl Castro Ruz. Hasta la victoria siempre. Firmado Fidel Castro Ruz, comandante en jefe de la República de Cuba.
Pero a Fidel yo le tengo miedo, yo. Porque Fidel te eriza el cuerpo y te pregunta cosas y se recuerda de todo. De todo. Fidel tiene una memoria. Y entonces a veces tú no te acuerdas de lo que él te pregunta y cuando él te lo recuerda tú te acuerdas. A Fidel hay que tenerle miedo. La gente cree que Fidel es... No. Fidel es una gente que hay que tenerle miedo. Si tú eres muy bueno, yo no soy tan bueno. Yo soy un poco... Y entonces yo tengo miedo a Fidel porque lo que yo creo que nadie sabe, Fidel sabe. Yo lo quiero mucho, pero lo quiero mucho y lo quiero ver un poco lejos. Quererlo como lo quiero yo. Porque hay un refrán que dice que si tú estás muy pegado al sol te quema. Y si estás muy lejos del sol, entonces te mueres de frío. Yo quiero estar al lado de Fidel, pero que no me queme. Éramos muy pobres, vivíamos en un pueblo, en Holguín, Levisa. Y bueno, yo tenía una tía que estaba casada con un político del antiguo presidente de este país, que fue un asesino, Batista, Fulgencio Batista. Mataron a mi madre. Y cuando veo que está muerta, decido irme. Nosotros nos fuimos para el segundo frente, que era donde estaba Raúl. Y en la comandancia de Raúl, imagínate, conocí allí a todo el mundo pasaba por la comandancia.
Our political philosophy is representative democracy and social justice in a well-planned economy.
Yo le decía el otro día a un general amigo mío, yo le decía, oye, han metido un cierre que no hay quien sepa del comandante. Entonces han hecho un cierre para que el enemigo no pueda manipular verdades. Que manipulen, que la siguen haciendo, pero que manipulen mentiras. Yo me reúno con gente muy fuerte en el país. Y nadie sabe nada.
¿Qué tal el Fidel?
Está mucho mejor, mucho mejor.
¿Qué tal Fidel?
El gobierno cubano dicen que está muy bien. No tengo conocimiento porque no tengo acceso. Pero al parecer se está recuperando.
¿Qué tal Fidel? ¿Está mejor?
Sí.
¿Está qué?
Está mejor.
¿Verdad?
Sí. Hay secreto de Estado, ¿me entiendes?
A los actores aquí se les paga bien, no se paga como en otras partes del mundo, como se paga en los países capitalistas. Ser actriz aquí en este país es muy agradable, porque el público te agradece todo el tiempo. Y si por ejemplo llegas a una tienda a comprar algo, te dan la prioridad, te saludan, porque como es la televisión, que se ve siempre en la casa, la gente te trata como si te conocieran de toda la vida. Esto no lo ha sostenido él solamente, lo ha sostenido el pueblo que lo ha seguido. No tengo ningún miedo, estoy muy segura de la dirección política de este país y más segura estoy del pueblo porque además soy parte de él. Y yo pienso que ningún cubano se preparó para este momento, para el momento en que él estuviera así, viejito, enfermito. No nos preparamos para eso porque es que fue un líder, ha sido un líder tan grande y con tanta connotación internacional que no nos preparamos, nunca pensamos en el momento en que nos pudiera faltar. Yo soy una de las que no estaba preparada, lo admiro y estoy orgullosa de él.
¿Es que más sabe? No, yo no sé qué gana, yo soy de aquí.
Es gana, de la parte de gana, de gana. Argelia gana por allá.
¿Qué quiere decir todas estas banderas?
Esto son la cantidad de muertos que ellos han hecho durante el terrorismo que han matado aquí en Cuba. Hay 138 banderas.
Y detrás
la ciudad, ¿cómo se llama? La embajada americana. Ponen un escrito que da la vuelta así completo. Se dicen tanta cosa, tanta basura.
No, hacen sus propagandas subversivas contra el gobierno cubano. Se tapan detrás de los derechos humanos para estar hablando de una cantidad de basura bárbara.
Nosotros, por ejemplo, no tenemos acceso a ver las noticias de la CNN, pero sin embargo tenemos otros programas informativos donde nos ponen algunos fragmentos.
Ellos deciden la cosa mostraros.
Exactamente, sí, no es, lo deciden porque me parece que no pienso que sea que nos manipulen la información, pero sí nos dan la que un poco los especialistas de la programación piensan que nosotros debemos ver, porque acuérdate que nosotros tenemos muchos enemigos en el norte, tenemos muchos enemigos que quieren verlo muerto y que quieren ver destruido este país.
Fidel muerto va a hacer más daño que vivo al imperialismo. Mira, yo quiero mucho a Raúl. Yo soy admirador de Raúl.
La gente no lo ama mucho en la calle.
Pero la gente no ama a Raúl porque no tienen la idea de quién es Raúl. Raúl es tan humano, Raúl es tan decente, ha jugado su rol como ministro de las Fuerzas Armadas. Pero yo te diría una cosa, que el que conoce a Raúl sabe que Raúl tiene más mano derecha y mano izquierda. Fidel es una gente muy buena y que habla muy bien, pero Fidel es por ahí. Raúl, una gente que ha cumplido al pie de la letra lo que dice el hermano.
Now, there have been a lot of questions raised about security here, and before I came on, we were walking around and talking to security officials.
Castro, he's shaking hands with Raúl Castro.
As Christian points out, President Obama just shook hands with Raúl Castro from Cuba. Now,
Dilma Rousseff of Brazil.
What does that say as a gesture?
It says that this is a moment of reconciliation for Mandela, and President Obama is doing the diplomatic thing. He's not just going to walk by and ignore these people who are there, and they're all in a line. He's kissing now the UN Secretary General, President Zuma.
This is a man, and it is so true, who brought people together in life, and he continues to bring people together in death.
Countries like Cuba are rethinking the way it does business. President Raúl Castro started leasing state-owned land to private farmers, clearing the way for the opening of small businesses. It is part of a step-by-step approach to move Cuba away from the old Soviet-style centralized economy. But as our correspondent in Cuba, Michael Voss, reported, more change in one sector of the economy brings more pressure for changes elsewhere.
This makeshift fruit and vegetable market in a dusty parking lot on the outskirts of Havana is the first wholesale outlet in Cuba not owned and run by the state. The market started as an illegal gathering. Now it's tolerated but tightly regulated. Almost all of the distribution and wholesale operations in Cuba continue to be controlled by large state-run monopolies, which so far none of the private businesses have access to. This is the first time that local private restaurants, as well as these self-employed street vendors, can buy in bulk. Now there's pressure to let other new businesses do the same. Cuba has a total workforce of 5 million people. In 2010, just 150,000 were registered as self-employed. Today, that's jumped to 430,000, according to the Ministry of Labor. Many, like Delvis Legro, who've opened clothes stalls, have to rely on a growing army of Cubans who can now freely travel abroad and return with bags bulging with merchandise.